Welcome everyone to the second episode of Know Thyself podcast, where tonight, we are very, very happy to be hosting with us Professor Marjorie Woollacott, who is also a dear friend and colleague from the Galileo Commission. She was Professor of Neuroscience at the University of Oregon for 30 years, and she has been opening up the path for scientists and academics from all different sorts of areas and fields to engage in the areas of intersections between meditation, spirituality, and scientific research. And so, Marjorie, I'm going to welcome you because I'd like you to share more about your work yourself. Welcome to our episode today.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here, Athena. And in terms of my background, I should say that in many ways, I wear two hats in the academic and research world. The first hat is the one that I wore during most of my career as a young neuroscientist, which is the hat of an academic, meaning a materialist neuroscientist academic. I was studying, for example, rehabilitation medicine, studying issues related to helping assess and treat patients with stroke or Parkinson's disease or children with cerebral palsy. And I had grants in that area, and I wrote a major textbook in that area. And so for me, it was very easy to get tenure at an academic university with that background in my human physiology department. And then partway through the career, which I'll talk about in a little while, I decided to actually go back and get an Asian studies degree because I wanted to begin to understand the philosophical underpinnings of whether it's materialism or post-materialism, idealism, all these different types of philosophies. And that led me on a new direction in my journey to try to integrate the philosophical side of the world with my neuroscience side and begin to put philosophy, meditation, spirituality, and science together. And in the last 5 to 7 years, I have been focusing primarily on truly understanding the nature of consciousness, looking at it from a scientific perspective and also from what I would call a philosophical perspective, looking at, for example, the philosophy of idealism, which I'll talk about a little bit later on. So right now I'm doing that integration of these two worldviews in my own research.
That is wonderful, Marjorie. So how about we start from the journey of knowing yourself? I think that I would be very interested, and our audience would be very interested to hear more about your work and your scientific work on the intersections between science and spirituality. It is a topic that concerns many of us nowadays, and it's actually at the cutting edge of public interest and even scientific research, as we know, in certain departments. But before we go into that, I'd like to begin or continue your interview with asking you, how does this ancient Hellenic Delphic precept, know thyself, been approached in your life? What does knowing yourself mean to you, has meant to you? And how has your journey into knowing yourself unraveled in your life? And how has it affected your approach to science and your scientific career?
I think that's a fascinating question, and I'm hoping that your listeners may want to go back in their own lives and sort of look at that journey for themselves of what it really has meant to them, know thyself. Because when I looked back after hearing that that might be a topic today, I realized that, first of all, when I was like about 4 years old, maybe, I remember telling my sister something to the effect that if some entity that we might call God, supreme divinity, does exist, then we should devote our life to that. So that was a young girl thinking in that moment about whatever this was, it was that important. And then, of course, I got involved in my schoolwork and a lot of other things, and I forgot about it for a while. But then when I was in the 11th grade in high school, I was taking the best class I've ever taken in all of my classes in throughout the educational system from a man named Mr. O'Neill, and it was on literature, and he was looking at the great books of the Western world, and he introduced me to Plato's allegory of the cave.
Oh.
And book changed my life. And it was the allegory that was so important to me because it helped me understand what I consider to be the true nature of the self. And that is that our ordinary perceptual reality basically is just our seeing shadows of the real and not true reality itself. And that we need to get out of what I would call the cave, Plato's cave of our five senses to see what's really underneath those five senses, what's the true nature of that apparent physical world around us. And then he introduced me to William James because he knew I was interested in the brain and the mind and the spirit. And William James is the father of our modern psychology. And the books that he wrote in the early 1900s were about the nature of consciousness and spiritual experience. So I was very excited in the 11th grade, and I thought, this is what I want to devote my career to. But then I went to college thinking, perhaps naively, that I could learn about the nature of our deepest self, seeing how our spirit might interpenetrate our mind and our brain. But in those first courses that I took in biology and psychology, I was told that there is no consciousness apart from the brain. The brain creates consciousness, and I believed it. I mean, I was given all this evidence from scientists that this is true. And so I put aside what I thought were my naive thoughts and beliefs from earlier in my childhood. So my own perspective on know thyself as a young scientist was then what I had been taught in my neuroscience courses in my undergraduate and my graduate school. And that's that consciousness is purely the product of the neurons in the brain. And thus, according to that understanding, to know myself was purely an objective phenomenon, I think that's really important because I decided that I would study the brain and the world around me objectively, and that would give me the answers. And I think here's the interesting thing. I was totally unaware of the importance of awareness, consciousness that was shining out through my own being and every being, of that subjective nature of consciousness. And then I should say, after years in graduate school and starting my first position actually at a university in Virginia, I went to a meditation retreat that was actually given to me as a birthday present by my sister with a meditation master from India. And in that retreat, I had an amazing awakening. And the awakening was literally to the feeling of an energy inside of my heart that was like pulsating outward with like infinite love and joy and radiating out beyond me. And I felt in that moment this incredible sense of being one with everything around me, the sense of interconnection with everything in the world. And I suddenly had this feeling that this is what the world is really about. It shifted my worldview completely from being a materialist, oh, I'm just a body and a brain and it's creating my consciousness, but it's ephemeral, to, oh my goodness, there's something more than that I've experienced at a very deep experiential subjective level. And I think what happened is that planted a seed inside of me of this new worldview, but it took many, many years to integrate that new worldview into my scientific career. So I should mention on just a bit about the fact that, as I said earlier, I did very well in my scientific career. I received tenure early on because of my grants doing research in rehabilitation medicine. And I also taught courses in that area and had no problems at all in academia. But then I decided at some point I needed to integrate these two halves of my life. I was leading what I call a schizophrenic world view of life. And so I said, how can I do this? So I decided during one of my sabbaticals to go to the University of Rochester in New York because they had an excellent Asian studies department there, and they were studying philosophies of India. And specifically, there's one philosophy called the recognition philosophy, which basically says, from the 10th century, by the way, and it basically says that all we need to do to really become like truly knowledgeable, if we want to call that to know ourselves, is to recognize who we really are, that we are infinite awareness, we are part of this infinite awareness, we're interconnected with everything and everyone, and then we will know ourselves, who we truly are. And so saying that, I then went back to the university and said, okay, how can I integrate now these two things into my university career? And I should say the first thing I tried to do was to begin to do research on meditation and yoga and things of that sort. And I was able to find students that wanted to do that, but I should say it was very difficult and challenging for two reasons. One was that when I tried to write grants to study meditation and yoga, I had much lower chances of getting those grants funded than when I studied stroke and Parkinson's disease. So that was one challenge. And the other was that then when my students wrote a paper on, for example, meditation and how it changes our attentional abilities, what I found is that the various journal editors who liked my papers on stroke and Parkinson's disease didn't want to receive my papers on meditation and yoga. So I saw right there my first barrier in academia. And then when I decided that I would like to teach some of this information to my undergraduates who were pre-med majors in the Human Physiology department, I went to my department chair and said, I would like to teach a course in complementary medicine to show students that there are other ways of healing beyond the usual one with pharmaceuticals and surgery. I said I would like to talk about, for example, energy healing or meditation, for example, or osteopathy. And at first, my department chair said, no one in our department is going to be interested in a course like that. These are pre-med majors interested in real science. And I said, look, I want to make this a rigorous course. I want us to look at research in the area. And I said, let's just give it a try. Let me teach it 1 year and see what happens. And of course, what happened was that when we put the course on the registration books, within a few days, the course was absolutely filled, and there was like a 25 student waiting list to get into that course.
Oh, wow.
That showed, I mean, the students want to know this. And I had a wonderful time teaching the course. Now, I should say the students would walk in and be somewhat skeptical about the idea that energy medicine might actually do something to heal you. But then we had them look carefully at the literature in the field. And I said, you're going to write a paper on the pros and the cons of what the research says about how this medicine works. And by the end, they were convinced that this was a great addition to our materialist way of treating disease. It's not that it's an either or, it's a both and. And they often wanted to go ahead and add this type of medical training to their medical career. So I think that for me, it was fascinating to watch the two sides of our society and its worldview, and the fact that the sad thing is that materialists think that it's an either or phenomenon. And I think what I am saying now as a neuroscientist is it's a both and phenomenon, that we can use the understanding from science to understand consciousness, but we also need to use the understanding from the subjective point of view of turning within to know ourselves. And that's what I was also trying to teach my students in those classes.
Wow. This is so fascinating and it's so rich. I don't even know where to begin. There were so many important points in the journey that you shared, and I'm sure there are so many other stations along this journey, and there's so many other details. I hope some of them will come out as we continue our conversation. But where I feel I'd like to continue with the questions, is the issue of consciousness. Consciousness as something that exists prior to the brain, or as awareness, as you said, that shines through our being, or consciousness as something that is produced just from the activities of the brain, the biochemical activities of the brain. And so we know that now that there's a great debate around this topic. There is evidence from both sides, but it appears that you're quite the expert. So because you spoke about how at the beginning of your journey, you kind of had this intuition about that greater reality, or that prior to the five senses reality being or truth, and then the awakening that you felt, kind of a first awakening with Plato, which is so fascinating that a story written thousands of years ago could still reverberate and start to awaken certain memories, or even, deeper understandings and intuitions in you. It's fascinating. But then, as you said, you went on to university, and that got buried for a while because you were taught that no, this is not the case. There is no such thing as spirit, and there's no consciousness outside the activities of matter. But then again, of course, you, as you described, did a full circle around that and found a way to marry those two, to understand the correlations between those two. And since you're an expert in those fields, could you help us also understand, based on scientific evidence, how is it that through your research you have come to seen, or to even scientifically provide evidence for the fact that consciousness is not simply a product of brain activity. Would you like to speak a bit more about that?
I would love to, because I think what happened is that once I began to try to integrate these two aspects of my life together, I realized that this was a key area for me as a neuroscientist to actually explore. It's like, what is the evidence that actually says that consciousness may be fundamental and not simply the product of neurons in the brain? That was the key issue. So the first thing I did was begin to look at particular phenomena that occur with, for example, near-death experiences, and in fact, deep meditation states. And in fact, now with the neuromodulatory drugs like psilocybin, because in each case, the person ends up having an experience that goes beyond their five senses. And often they have an experience of unity awareness, a sense of interconnection with all things around them. They often basically feel that time no longer exists. They're feeling past, present, and future as one. They have abilities also, for example, to be able to know what another person is thinking. They have an ability to know the future. And these things are impossible from my neuroscientist perspective as a materialist. So I wanted to say, what can I learn about that? Is this really true? Is it not true? Let me look at the research evidence. I also want to take one step back and say, until I had that meditative awakening, I would never look at the literature on near-death experiences or meditation because I knew the literature couldn't be true according to my materialist worldview. And I think this is the problem with most materialist scientists, is that they quote unquote know that their worldview is the only correct worldview. So why would you explore anything outside of that worldview? So when I finally went to the literature, and I am literally meaning indexes like the PubMed index database from the National Institutes of Health in the United States that has all the articles on all topics related to medicine, there are many, many papers on near-death experiences and that phenomena. There are many, many papers on deep meditation states and on, of course, neuromodulatory drugs like psilocybin. And what these papers all say is, first of all, that when you go into a mystical state, what appears to happen is that particular parts of your brain basically turn down or turn off. I'm going to take a step back because those parts of the brain that are now being turned down are in fact what we call the filters of our brain that are very functional in daily life, keeping us from experiencing way too much information that we couldn't really actually assimilate and use. But when they basically are filtering out like 90% of all the information coming in, we lose our ability to see important aspects of the world. So for example, there's something called the default mode network in the brain, which is in fact in the posterior cingulate cortex is one place, medial frontal cortex here, and a few other places. What its job is to create a narrative for ourselves about how we relate to the world. And that narrative allows us to function very well in the world. And it also filters out most of what else is happening in the world. And I give the example of myself, like walking down the forest road some days, and I won't even be aware of what was going on around me because I was lost in my internal narrative about some conversation I had with a colleague earlier in the day. That's how powerful these filters are. So the point is that when you have a near-death experience, of course, your heart stops. And in fact, when your heart stops beating, your brain stops functioning. And in that state, all your filters are now knocked out. And people then have these out-of-body experiences. They feel a sense of white light, of oneness with things around them, with everything around them. And they often have experiences of hearing conversations in the operating room where people are trying to resuscitate them, seeing things from above their bodies. These are things that, according to a materialist worldview, are impossible. And the beauty is that we are now carefully in science actually showing that these things are true. There have been beautiful articles by Bruce Grayson, an MD at the University of Virginia, Pim van Lommel, who's in the Netherlands, who have done prospective studies bringing everybody into hospitals that has had a cardiac arrest. And then those that survive, they ask them, did anything unusual happen to you during that cardiac arrest? And then if the people, I think it's about 12 to 15% of the people have a deep near-death experience where they leave their body, they see things going on in the resuscitation room, and we have therefore clear evidence that when the brain isn't functioning, consciousness is still existing, and people are giving accurate information about everything going on around them. So there's one bit of evidence. And then when when you look at deep meditation experiences, people find the same thing. People have these mystical experiences in deep meditation that, in fact, are ones of unity awareness. Often, again, people may leave their body. They have a sense of total joy, somewhat like that experience that I had in my first meditation. And again, when people put those persons in that deep state of meditation into a functional magnetic scanning machine, an fMRI, we find that those filters of the brain are turned way down, and that seems to allow us to expand our awareness. And of course, now the same things are happening with studies on psilocybin. When people are given psilocybin and then put into a fMRI machine for a brain scan, it's exactly the same filters of the brain that are turned down. So I think those are three examples of the fact that we now know that it's brain filters that are in our way of these expansive states, and that we actually can quiet those filters down and then have these more expansive states of awareness.
That is fascinating. So basically, what I hear this to be suggesting, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that consciousness expresses itself through the brain, and it limits its possibilities through the conditioning that takes the form of filters in the actual chemical, neurological activity, and therefore structure of the brain, something that we know nowadays from studies on meditators that can also be changed due to neuroplasticity. So would you say that this evidence around those areas of meditative states, mystical states, near-death experiences is suggesting that consciousness is something actually prior to the brain and much broader than the brain, and uses the brain as a vehicle rather than being then a product of that organ?
Absolutely. And I think that, in fact, the theories that we then talk about are either called the filter theories or the transmission theories of consciousness, meaning that consciousness is transmitted into the brain and into the nervous system so that, in fact, we can function in a physical body. You would need that in a physical body, but it's not the source of consciousness. It is instead something that actually can transmit consciousness and allow it to be expressed through our words, our concepts, etc.
That is amazing. And the notion of filters and narratives, which is something that we find in Plato's allegory of the cave, and as you know, in almost all spiritual traditions and in ancient Hellenic philosophy. But from a philosophical point of view, we speak about those filters being our convictions, being our beliefs, being the way we have been socialized and cultured into the world, and therefore we look at the world through those conditioned filters or lenses, and therefore the experience of the world that we have corresponds to the filters that we or the glasses that we wear. In the same way, as one of my good friends and teachers bring this example, he says that, if we look at snow wearing orange tinted glasses, we're going to say, oh, the snow is orange, right? We're never going to see the whiteness of it. So I think there are fascinating correlations here between philosophy, the study of mindfulness, meditation that works with those filters and with those convictions and beliefs, and, as you say now, scientific neurological research that shows how those filters are then actually somehow plasted or structured into our very brains.
Right. And I should mention that, in fact, as you talk about language, because I think, as you say, most of the philosophies talk about language being a real problem that limits our understanding of the world. We concretize things as soon as we give them a word. And that we have found that, in fact, we have a left side of the brain and a right side of the brain. And the left side of the brain is basically our language side of the brain that's making everything linear and taking it apart into individual concepts. And then, of course, we have the right side of the brain that sees things holistically, where language isn't such an important thing. And if, in fact, Jill Bolte Taylor, a neuroanatomist, had a stroke where, in fact, it was the left side of the brain that was basically turned off during the stroke, she had experiences of unity awareness, and she lost all of her ability to really talk to people for a while until she recovered. But it's that point that, in fact, it's not just a psychological concept. We know the parts of the brain that actually turn us into people that have a compartmentalized way of looking at reality. And we're dividing it up into tiny parts and then not even seeing much of reality that's out there because of our words.
Well, but apparently there are ways to change those filters.
Yes.
Near-death experiences or other spontaneous awakenings. We're going to say something about the book that you recently published along with David Lorimer,
Yeah.
and many of us participate in, because I think it's a very important publication people should know about. But we also know that there is the phenomenon of neuroplasticity, which basically states that we can work on those concretized structures that correspond to our cultural, social, linguistic, or even religious, ethnic, whatever that may be, conditioning through meditation.
Yes. And I should say that, yes, there's a lot of research now on that related to neuroplasticity. Richie Davidson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison has done a lot on that in his own laboratory. And one of the things that's interesting about that is that one of the things that seems to happen is that when we meditate, we are strengthening what I would call our intentional parts of our brain. We have an intention to quiet the mind and focus the mind on the breath, for example. And when we do that, we're strengthening all these areas in the prefrontal cortex, so they will inhibit our impulsive areas of the brain that want to let our mind wander like a monkey mind from one thing to another. And so what is happening over hour after hour of meditation is we're becoming able to reduce our impulsivity and instead leave a space whenever anything happens, so that we can be quiet and let the frontal lobe then decide how we want to respond in a loving and a compassionate way. So one of the beautiful things is that it makes us better human beings by not having that thing where we want to press the react button too quickly. We rest in that. But the other thing that's most important is that it's truly quieting the mind down. And of course, how do we do that? We do it by, first of all, focusing. We focus within on the breath. That's standard across all traditions, or perhaps on a mantra. Because again, it's that you take all those extraneous thoughts that are going in every direction and you pull them down to one thought, so that then that one thought can disappear, and then you're in pure presence, and those filters in the brain are now no longer really functioning the way they were before, and you can see things as they are.
That's wonderful, and it's really refreshing to hear how science, from its own perspective, I mean, mainstream science is actually turning its attention to focus on phenomena that have been reported, and on those topics that have concerned mystics and philosophers since ancient times, rather than putting them under the carpet. I mean, that doesn't apply for everyone nowadays, but there is that turn and movement, which brings me to this topic that again you mentioned in the beautiful introductory speech sharing that you had, the topic of ontology.
Yes.
So you mentioned that, sharing with us your own story, that what you often saw at university or different research and other institutions, that there was a resistance to take into account experiences, reports on certain experiences, evidence that were there, just on account of the fact that it didn't correlate, or it didn't harmonize, it didn't agree with the existing perspective, the materialist point of view. And in saying that, and then speaking about the issue of filters, it seems to me that science is kind of doing, I mean, not all science, but mainstream and materialistic science is doing what we do before we start to engage in the process of knowing ourselves and meditating. It has set up some filters about what is true or not true, possible or impossible, acceptable or unacceptable, and it kind of shuts out any information that could shake that construct. But then, of course, that brings science into difficult situation or relationship with itself, because science arose as precisely humans' effort to get away from dogmas, to be able to question reality, to be able to take into account evidence that would contradict, let's say, religious views or other types of dogmatic established views, and to be able to function with an open-mindedness and freedom of thought that would be able to entertain an argument, as we say in philosophy, even if that argument did not appear true, just for the sake of embarking into the unknown and not being attached to pre-established axioms, assumptions, and notions. And so it seems that science is contradicting its originary impulse and spirit, and has, to some extent, materialistic science established itself as a dogma that doesn't allow, it has like, you know how we speak about spiritual bypass, it has like scientific bypasses. And so why do you think that is the case? What is threatened in us when, you know, we have to admit evidence that may contradict or even challenge our ontological worldview? And what's going on in science? You've seen it from the inside. What is the mainstream ontology, and why is there resistance to the study of things that you, for example, have studied and brought to university with so much success?
Well, what I realize now that I have looked back over the ages too at this particular debate between what we could call materialism and post-materialism, consciousness fundamental, is that it's probably been going on for 2,500 years or maybe throughout history, is that there are certain people, like I was probably as a young neuroscientist, that I basically knew that the world of the five senses was absolutely real to me, and I could see it, I could perceive it, and I hadn't really had a mystical experience yet. And therefore, when somebody said that they had had a mystical experience, I just sort of smiled, you know, it's like, oh yeah, you know, that's a weak-minded individual. They don't know what's really real. So one of them is that if you haven't had the experience yet, you're probably likely to be a materialist, at least in the beginning of your life, because that's all you know. That's fine. But then what happens is that materialists, like I was as a young neuroscientist, start training other students. And like my professors trained me to say, this is the belief system that is true and correct. They now have created a dogma around the research studies that they have done. And once the dogma is there, we are afraid to let that dogma or that belief system go. And I think there's the real crux of the matter. In fact, what I should say is that once I began to study meditation and these expanded states of awareness, and I would talk to a friend who was a previous colleague, and I would say, well, you know, why don't you come to this meditation program with me just to hear what it's about? And they would get a look of fear in their eyes. And it was like, oh no, it's like they were afraid they would get whatever virus I had that would keep them then from being a proper materialist scientist, and they would then lose their credibility in the world. So this is, I think, one of the problems, is that the dominant culture becomes that which is credible. And if we move out of the dominant culture, we are no longer part of the herd, so to speak. And we are then not able to function in the same optimal way with our colleagues who have a very different worldview than we do. So that, I think, is one of the critical issues. And one of the things I say about that is all we need to do is have curiosity. And it reminds me a little bit of the story that everybody hears about Galileo saying, look, just look through my telescope and you'll see, you know, the moon as it really looks, et cetera. And then, you know, some of his colleagues from the church would say, excuse me, it cannot be true. So I will not look through your telescope because it can't be true. And that's what the scientists of today are doing. They're saying, when we say, look at the evidence on near-death experiences, they will say, it's impossible to be true. Why would I bother looking at those papers? And I should mention that a colleague of mine, who's actually a part of the Academy for the Advancement of Post-Materialist Sciences, Stefan Schwartz, was once in a debate with a man who was a materialist, arguing whether a post-materialist consciousness being primary perspective was actually one that one might adopt versus a materialist perspective. And after he talked about his own understandings of why it should be true, the other scientist simply says something to the effect of, when he asked, it can't be true, and he says, well, have you read my papers? Because I have all the evidence there. And he said, why would I read your papers? They're not going to be true. So right there is the problem, that there is the lack of a curiosity. Why can't we just say, let me look with curiosity at the papers that claim to be supporting another view, and then make my own decision with my own intellectual curiosity? So I think if we can begin from the beginning with, I'm thinking now of education with young children, remind them that there are multiple models of consciousness and that they need to have the curiosity to make their own decisions about those models from looking at the evidence. That would be wonderful.
Yes, I agree with you. And it's kind of a good luck that we live in a time that there are more scientists such as yourself and more academics who are willing and daring to look through that telescope and who are inviting other people and other students and saying, look, if we really want to be scientists, we have to maintain the curiosity, the openness of mind, the freedom of thought. So it's wonderful that you've been doing that, and I'm sure your students have enjoyed it in this class you were describing very much. But that brings me to another topic, which we had also discussed in relation to both the report, the Galileo Commission report, and the call for a renaissance of the spirit in the humanities. And the term we gave it in the call, in that document, was epistemological discrimination. And I think you hinted on that right now in your sharing. You said that you've often encountered this with colleagues, or you had found some resistance to what you were doing, or some skepticism during your time at university. And so just to clarify for our audience, what we mean by epistemological discrimination is what we often academics or researchers have experienced in our fields of study, in universities, in academic institutions, even in schools, that certain perspectives and even certain evidence, as Marjorie is sharing, are not allowed in the discussion. It's like we have a preconceived notion of what is right and wrong, true and untrue, and anything that doesn't agree with that is left out of the discussion. And so in our careers as academics, we sometimes find moments or events or encounters where there is a bias against our point of view, our worldview, or even our very concrete experiences. So I want to ask you, have you encountered epistemological discrimination? You've mentioned something about this, if you could expand a bit on it. And have you experienced bias? And how have you dealt with those moments of challenge? What was your inner process? Did you feel fear? Did you feel rejection through this? Did you ever, feel that you had to hide from your colleagues? And how did you navigate through those challenges yourself?
Yes, wonderful question. And I should say that, first of all, because I had at least started in an area that in terms of epistemological discrimination, I was on the other side in a certain sense, doing my work with stroke and Parkinson's disease and helping patients. I was considered a very credible scientist. And then because I wrote a textbook in the area, so that I'm teaching now other people that are clinicians these understandings and processes, that also raised my credibility even higher. And then when in the last 10 years of my career, I started to add in research on meditation and yoga, Tai Chi, to try to say, what did they say about improving our wellness and our well-being? That's when I began noticing it. So even though I was a credible scientist, I had tenure, I was a full professor, when I would, for example, have this one paper that a student wrote on looking at different types of meditation and their ability to help our attentional abilities so that we can focus more. And we started out at one of the journals that I usually publish my papers on rehabilitation medicine in. And the editor immediately rejected it without even sending it out for review, simply saying, no, we don't publish research in this area. And then another one would do the same thing. And finally, I got to a 5 down the row where I finally was able to get someone to send it out for review, and then it was accepted. But what we see is that those journals that are the most credible in science also have the most biased editors and reviewers. And they only want materialist work because they're worried that if they do something, publish research on meditation, they will lose their own credibility. And of course, we've seen that with TEDx talks, and we all know about TEDx talks where scientists are talking about their research, and these are very popular talks, but people like Rupert Sheldrake and others who began to talk about things related to consciousness being fundamental on a TEDx talk found that their talks ended up being banned because materialists would complain to the TEDx people, and they would then take the talk down. So there is that problem that we have with the bias toward one particular epistemological worldview and trying to move our society more toward being accepting of both and exploring them, I think is what's happening right now since the manifesto was published and then the Renaissance for the Humanities was also published. We right now are trying to help move that toward a curiosity where people that are editors actually say, well, let me look at this paper and see whether it's really perhaps less rigorous than the person's previous papers that she was writing on stroke. Maybe, in fact, they're equally rigorous, but just on a different topic. Maybe that's fine. So I think that's one of those areas of epistemological discrimination that I've noticed. And I think others too, of course, are in the teaching area. And the fact that I taught this course on complementary medicine for, I think, about 12 years at the university, and then I retired. And the students loved that course. It was always filled to capacity. They could not find another professor to teach that course after I retired from the university because those teachers were all materialistically oriented and really had no interest in teaching a course on complementary medicine. So, of course, some people say that science changes one funeral at a time. I realize that's a famous quote, and I hope it's not just that. But I think there's a certain element to hopefully the young people coming up with new interests and getting their PhDs in those interest areas and then beginning to do research. And of course, I do tell my graduate students that if you want to do research on meditation or near-death experiences or topics of that sort, also have a second parallel line of research that is within the mainstream of your university so that you will get tenure based on that. And then you can add in the other research in parallel. And then after you have tenure, expand that area. But that's the safest way to be able to help shift society. And it's sad that we have to do that.
Which is exactly what Jeff was talking about in the first interview. He was speaking about being Superman and Clark Kent and how we have to play both roles. And then we had this discussion about why do we need to pretend to play roles and what does that show about, now we're coming to the issue of values. What does that show about the values that are the leading principles of our universities?
Absolutely. Curiosity is not one of them. I mean, curiosity is a little bit lower than you can have curiosity within this paradigm, but we can't move over to another paradigm and compare them.
And it's so interesting because you're agreeing in a way with what Jeff said, that the more established a discipline is, the harder it is to have it to open up to innovation, to novelty, to difference, to diversity. And I think what you shared about the peer review articles and the journal situation depicts a very similar notion and picture.
Right. I think that is absolutely critical. And it gets back to the whole idea of conceptuality and the fact that the older the discipline is, the more concepts that have come into being as absolute truths. And then to actually decide that you're going to challenge that absolute truth takes a lot of courage. And often, and we know in the scientific field as well, that you can be actually dismissed and lose a job and your name is forgotten until 50 years later, somebody actually proves that you were correct. But, because they've finally gotten the research up to actually speed in that sense. And those are the sad stories about somebody that's been pushed out of academia. And then it's like, oh, later on, oh, he was correct. We just didn't quite understand. So.
And that shows the politics of science. And of course, we have Kuhn's The Revolutions in Scientific Paradigms, the idea of a paradigm, which is not a scientific thing in itself. It's actually a political thing. So in as much as science would like to think, or other academic areas that are immune to sociological factors or political factors, they're actually politicized. They work with notions of established and we, others, difference, and so forth. So I think that's a very, very important understanding that, I mean, speaking from a philosophical perspective, it would be really nice for us as academics and scientists to sit down and have some self-reflection on those elements and see how they perhaps may be hindering our love and commitment to freedom of thought and openness and diversity.
Athena, I want to mention one other thing that I've been aware of throughout my career that always has bothered me, and that is that within a university that has departments in the humanities and the sciences, et cetera, the salaries that were given to people in the sciences were always higher than those in the humanities. And it was purely economic from the university's perspective, I suppose. But it was like, you're bringing in all this grant money from medical foundations and the National Institutes of Health, et cetera. So because you're bringing in all this money, we will value you more and actually raise your salaries. But wait a minute, what is value about? Is it really just about bringing in money to the university? I mean, aren't we academic institutions interested in truth and knowledge, in which case we should have something that says humanities are equally valuable to the scientists, and or we should have grants that are given to the humanities in equal amounts from our nation and others as they are in the scientists. And I think that's just a sad point of the way we as human beings operate.
We're talking about revolutionary ideas here, Marjorie.
Yes.
And so well, it is a cultural revolution, and that was actually Kuhn's title of his book, the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So that brings me to another question. What would you say to a young scientist nowadays, or a young researcher or philosopher even, but I will focus more on scientists because that is an area that perhaps you know better, but please, of course, you don't need to limit your advice to any specific or particular field. But what would you say to a young scientist that starts now on that journey and that they do have either a more spiritually expanded point of view, or even experiences, or even an interest in exploring the science of spirituality or the spirituality of science? Of course, you did mention before what you would advise them to kind of have a two-tier research track. But other than that, I think it would be a good opportunity if you'd like to also mention that there are increasingly arising, like sprouting in society, all those alternative networks or institutions where science and philosophy and other areas can be approached through a non-materialist or a post-materialist paradigm. So I don't know if you'd like to mention anything about your work around that, and your advice, of course, to young scientists and seekers.
Definitely. I mean, the first thing I would say is that I know many other people that are now doing research in this post-materialist area of research are happy to advise graduate students. Now, because I'm retired from my university, they can't come into my own laboratory, but I'm happy to be a committee member on a committee for anyone at another university who would be interested in doing this. And I know that a lot of other people in the Scientific and Medical Network and, for example, the IONS group, and then also the AAPS are willing to do that. So that's one way. And the other thing that you're mentioning is that if these students want to join, for example, the Scientific and Medical Network, or the Galileo Commission, or we have student groups in Scientific and Medical Network and in the AAPS, they can then network with other students and with these faculty advisors in terms of how to bring that research forward, how to get grant funding. And in one case, we have one of our students in the AAPS that is actually on a grant that a number of us researchers have received from the Bial Foundation related to terminal lucidity in adults and children, which is that time when, just before death, when the brain has deteriorated, the body has deteriorated, they come back to perfect lucidity in the last minutes to hours of life, say goodbye to everyone, and then leave. And the question is, to the neuroscientist, how can a diseased brain and body actually be able to do that? So that particular young student is doing research with us. She will have papers out related to those topics. So I think part of it is your own desire and yearning and intention, and then knocking on the door of research professors that are doing this research and saying, is there any way that I can collaborate with you, that I can do a PhD project in which you might collaborate along with my other committee members, or things of that sort? Right now, as I'm doing my own research, I go onto this PubMed database and I look up the topic of meditation or the topic of psilocybin. And there are so many articles within the last year or two alone because suddenly these areas are burgeoning. So I think the good news is that things are changing and people now have permission to study, for example, psilocybin and the mystical effects it has and how it can really help with addictions. And the same thing with meditation, that's very, very useful in increasing our health and well-being and giving us these wonderful mystical states. So I do know that things are little by little, step at a time changing. And it's a matter of the student finding the right lab to begin to work in. And then with those two parallel goals in their research, I think they'll be able to actually move society forward.
It's wonderful. And I hope it's going to be very helpful for scientists that are going to be listening to this. Since now in neuroscience and relevant research, we are observing that there are elements or functions of consciousness that cannot be reduced to brain activity or that operate outside or beyond the, as you said, filters or specific structures and networks of the brain, or in case of terminal lucidity and then psychedelics as well, a great issue and very big topic currently in our societies. How are neuroscientists suggesting that we go about to study all those dimensions or expressions of consciousness that we cannot study through studying the brain?
I think that's what we might call the $64,000 question. Part of the issue that people are really, we're trying to do is to say, okay, we know there is vast consciousness and we're in some way connected to it. We know that then we have a perception, for example, of intuitions coming through our brain or some prediction of the future coming through our brain. It comes into our perceptual reality, but how did it get from out there into our perception? What is that interface really all about? And of course, it's very complex because we know that when those people with near-death experiences are sitting on the operating room table with a heart that is stopped with a flat EEG, they are aware. They don't need a brain to be aware. So the brain is not actually necessary, but we do have a brain in most of our interactions in the real world. So I think there's the trick. It's complex. It may end up being a both and phenomena. You can have these perceptions without a brain. We know that from near-death experiences. But in ordinary reality, we have the brain, and therefore we need to be able to deal with the filters on the brain to allow this extra information to come through. How it is actually transmitted and received by the brain at the moment, I don't think there are any really good theories about that. I know that IONS, the Institute of Noetic Sciences, is actually putting out calls for people's proposals to study things like this related to the primacy of consciousness. And they are giving basically monetary awards to the best proposals for people saying, this is how I would study it, to say, well, then maybe we can go ahead and give money for this particular type of proposal.
Wow. That's going to move things forward since, as you're saying, right now, it seems that there are no viable or acceptable theories about that. But could we also say here, and of course, I'm actually posing it as a question. I'm not claiming to have the answer to this. It's not like a rhetorical question. But could we perhaps see the wisdom in ancient traditions? And we started from the precept, know thyself. Which basically seems to suggest that there are aspects of awareness of our consciousness that, since they're not mediated by the brain or they're prior to the activity of the brain, there is no way in which we can understand them or access them materially, but rather just by starting to use our consciousness in a conscious way. And as the saying goes, turn the mind's eye onto itself. Something we have this expression even in Plato around the parable of the allegory of the cave, as you mentioned, that says you have to turn the mind's or consciousness eye onto itself and let it explore itself. And that is what we mean when we say to know ourselves. it's consciousness, I consciousness, to know myself, and to what extent do we need measurements, or do we need something that works at the level of quantity, or to what extent do we need instruments to do that? So is it possible that science is leading us nowadays to a place that realizes that this is up to the point that I can go, and now you have to employ the greatest technological, scientific instrument that you were given, which is consciousness itself? And so, it's like science. Could we say that science leads us to the point that we accept that now the realm of spiritual exploration of or self-inquiry is the next step of scientific evolution, therefore uniting the two areas that were once united, then separated, now perhaps they're reunited, science and spirituality?
Yes, I think that the way I see it myself is that science can actually explore within a particular domain, which is the space-time domain of our regular physical reality, but it doesn't really know how to go much beyond that. And what we're saying is that the ancient traditions have reminded us that there's this other type of inquiry, which is, as you say, turning back toward consciousness, really looking within to understand who we are in that way where we're allowing consciousness itself to explore itself. And I think it's truly a both and, that you need both of them. And then hopefully we'll find a way to actually find the interface that makes it all become part of one true whole of understanding about how the universe works. And I think that most people that I know that are modern scientists, when they begin to explore subjectivity in terms of this true reality of knowing thyself, they go back to these ancient traditions. They go back to Plato. I went back to the recognition philosophy of Kashmir from the 10th century, where these wonderful philosophers, Utpaladeva was one of them, Abhidhamma was another, were saying these same things, again, from the subjective perspective and showing their understanding. And then I could see how, modern science and these ancient philosophies are looking in parallel at similar things and helping me to give a bigger picture of what really is happening. So I think that's probably the ultimate reality, is having the scientists and the philosophers really work together with their own two parallel processes of knowing about reality to find a bigger truth.
Yes, because even the observation of space-time, even the idea of matter is an idea. It occurs within our consciousness.
Yes, absolutely.
So we tend to think that there's an outside world and I experience it. Well, where do I experience it? In my own consciousness. Therefore, the only thing I can know about the world is my awareness of it. And then, perhaps we're led to more radical theories now about whether matter really exists or not, which is a topic of concern scientifically and philosophically again since ancient times. We did mention near-death experiences and even terminal lucidity. And it seems that there is something very cultured about the way we approach science in the West as a child of the West. Because if we visit traditions and cultures such as India or even Tibetan Buddhism, we find that there are such experiences and notions that have been studied for many, many centuries now. And I'm inspired right now, listening to you speaking about terminal lucidity and those phenomena, to remember that in Tibetan Buddhism, there is often some states that are mentioned, states of where basically the great master or the meditator, even after the body dies, can stay awake. And they have even studied that there can be also brain activity for days, 3 days, even 7 days after the heart has stopped. And I think there is a name about this, like tum something that I do not pronounce correctly, most likely. But they have names for those states. They have practices that can make someone reach them and accomplish them. So there may be an issue here of culture or cultural situatedness of our scientific perspectives. I don't know if that's something that you'd like to comment on.
Well, I want to say that, yes, I think that's the case. And I know that, again, Dr. Richard Davidson from the University of Wisconsin-Madison has been working with the Dalai Lama and his monks. And in one particular interview, he said, when a particular interviewer was saying, well, I heard that you were now beginning to study these after-death phenomena in the physiology of the body and the brain of these great Rinpoches or whatever. And he said, well, the Dalai Lama and I had agreed not to talk about this, but now that he's talking about it, I guess I'll go ahead and talk about it too. So again, you see that here is the East meeting the West, and the West being afraid to talk about it, the East knowing that it's part of their own tradition and they have their own truth about it. And finally, tentatively, the West is tiptoeing up and beginning to explore it. And hopefully that will happen more and more and more as we begin to cross cultures and looking at our own understanding of reality and the way the physiology of the body and consciousness actually interpenetrate.
It is inspiring and hopeful. So my last question to you, Marjorie, is how do you envision the future of science and universities based on the developments you've seen and you have helped build in our scientific discourses and in different departments in the West nowadays? How would you envision that vision and future? It can be, a very wild imagination, and please feel free to share it. It can be something more modest, but how do you intuit this? How do you envision it?
Well, first of all, I'm really excited about the fact that if you look across both the United States and I think a number of European universities too, there are more and more departments that actually deal with phenomena that are related to, for example, telepathy, near-death experiences, other sorts of unusual things like meditation, etc. And often these are called contemplative studies programs at the university. And so they're trying to bring together science and meditation. Lisa Miller at Columbia University is doing very interesting research on what they call the awakened life at the university, bringing spirituality back into the students' awareness as they're going through the university so that they can grow spiritually as well as scientifically and academically. So those things are more and more accepted. And I'm thinking that as we begin to integrate these two halves of who we really are as human beings, the scientific and also understanding that consciousness is fundamental, we may begin to see a whole revolution in universities. It may not happen instantaneously, but I think step by step, we are moving in that direction.
Yes, that's great. And I would actually like to say that I agree with you, and I'm observing a similar trend and movement arising, and it's wonderful that there are people in universities that are bringing this forth with courage, because it needs courage. One needs to be brave for those changes, as you have been. And let me seize this opportunity to mention that you have done something that's, very, very helpful, contributing to that shift. And it is the publication of that wonderful book on spiritual awakenings, and scientists and academics that share their stories, that was published last year. And I had the joy to actually have an interview with you and also contribute with an essay. That is, I think, a great contribution to that turn, because you actually got how many? About 50, 52,
57, yes.
57 scientists and academics to speak about their own awakening experiences and their efforts of integrating those into their lives. And I think there is a second volume coming now as well, right?
There's a second volume coming out that will probably be relating to additional scientists, hopefully that will also share their experiences, in addition to a volume on synchronicities that a lot of the scientists are beginning to actually write essays for as well. So I'm looking forward to both of those volumes, because what's happening is that some of these scientists have never shared these experiences before publicly, and now they're willing to do it, and therefore everyone else is beginning to see, oh, they've had one too, then I can share mine.
Yes. Yes, coming out of the closet, as we say, in the ontological closet. Yes. Okay, that's great. So thank you so much, Marjorie, for being with us and sharing your light and your story and your wisdom. There are some true gems that have come out of this conversation, and I can't wait to publish it. It's incredible the work you've done on the intersections of neuroscience and spirituality. And I really look forward to hearing more about your work as we go forward. And please feel free to connect with Marjorie. We're going to leave your website links and some of the book links below in the description box. So thank you so much, Marjorie, for this.
Thank you, Athena. It was wonderful talking together.
Ζευ πάτερ, πίσον έθριν, δώσ' δε φως ιδέσθε, ή να πάυσει πλέον σφαγισμένη η τλίμων αλήθεια.